Imagine the humid, pulsating heart of Lagos, Nigeria, where the sun doesn't just shine, it interrogates. This is where we find Vivian Anderson, a woman whose spirit is as resilient as the city she calls home, yet burdened by a shadow she never saw coming. Vivian isn't a high-flying executive or a celebrity influencer. She is a simple woman with a generous heart that ultimately became her undoing. At 32, she helps her aunt manage a modest bookstore cafe on Lagos Island, a place that smells of old paper, vanilla, and the desperate hopes of a struggling middle class. Her days are a blur of inventory counts, brewing coffee, and managing customers who range from appreciative bookworms to arrogant businessmen who treat her with casual disdain. Vivian's dream is humble. She wants to expand the cafe, to create a sanctuary for people to escape the chaos of Lagos traffic and life's pressures. Her kindness is her defining trait. She is the type to give a free pastry to a crying child, or spend an hour listening to an elderly customer's lonely stories. But beneath her gentle smile lies a crushing weariness, a sense of stagnation that adulthood has forced upon her. She lives in a small, cramped apartment in Yaba, where the power often fails and the noise from the street is relentless. Vivian's life is filled with people, yet she feels a profound underlying loneliness, a longing for something or someone to truly see her. This generosity, this inherent need to pour kindness into the world, led her to a volunteer program where she wrote encouraging, heartfelt letters to soldiers stationed overseas in peacekeeping missions. She never knew their names, their ranks, or what battles they were fighting. She just wanted them to know they were not forgotten, that someone back home cared. She didn't know that one of those letters, written on cream-colored paper and filled with sincere, honest words rather than forced motivation, would land in the hands of the wrong person. Now, imagine a stark contrast, a world removed from the noise of Lagos. We cut to Frederick Gambo, a 32-year-old Nigerian military commander, returning from an overseas peacekeeping mission. If Lagos is a chaotic symphony, Frederick is a silent, disciplined fortress. Before the event that shattered his life, he was an imposing figure, a man respected and feared by his soldiers for his cold, unyielding focus under pressure. He was a weapon, not a man. He had stopped feeling human years ago, preferring the silence of military operations to the complexities of civilian life. He would reject care packages, ignore letters, and retreat into his duties, leaving no room for emotion or connection. He was seemingly content in his isolation, but the reality was a deeply buried, painful emptiness. His mission was survival, not living. One night, while stationed in a harsh, dusty desert environment, unable to sleep after a devastating operation, boredom drove him to open a forgotten package that had been dropped by his bunk. Inside, beneath the biscuits and toiletries, was a cream-colored envelope addressed simply, "To a soldier." The letter within was from Vivian Anderson, a woman he had never met, living in a city he hadn't seen in years. Her words were different. They weren't pitying or motivational, they were simply kind. She talked about the chaotic Lagos traffic, the exhaustion of adulthood, and her work at a bookstore. She thanked him for surviving and pleaded with him to stay alive, telling him that someone out here was praying for him. For the first time in years, Frederick felt spoken to not as a weapon, but as a human being. Her words anchored him in the midst of war and destruction. He memorized them, carried the letter inside his vest during missions, and pulled it out during sleepless nights. He began to imagine this woman, Vivian. Maybe she had soft brown eyes and a smile that could heal broken things. For the first time, he smiled too. Months passed and then the inevitable occurred. His plane was attacked during a violent operation, crashing in a horrific explosion of fire and metal. Frederick barely survived, but when he finally woke up in a military hospital, his entire world was unrecognizable. Burn scars stretched across the left side of his face and neck, twisting his features into something unrecognizable. The confident officer who once walked proudly was gone, replaced by a man who now hid from his own reflection. He retreated further into isolation, consumed by anger, shame, and a devastating belief that he was now unlovable, a monster in the eyes of the world. But amidst the darkness, one thought remained. He had to find Vivian Anderson, the woman whose words had saved him. Now back in Lagos, Frederick lives a ghost-like existence in a luxurious, sterile apartment overlooking Banana Island, hidden behind tinted windows, caps, and gloves. He is broken, ruined, and unrecognizable, fueled only by an obsession that is quickly morphing into something dangerous. He used his military connections to track Vivian down, finding her picture on her bookstore's business page. Seeing her online image, seeing her smile, something possessive and terrifying took root inside him. He didn't want to meet her as a scarred, broken man. He wanted to possess her, to make her his, even if she never knew who he was. And so the stalking began. Frederick memorized her routines, watched her from the shadows, learning when she arrived at work, how she interacted with customers, what her favorite drinks were. He was everywhere she turned, a constant, unseen presence, making her feel an unsettling uneasiness she couldn't explain. Vivian's simple life is slowly eroding. She's terrified, barely leaving her apartment, unable to go to church or the market, paralyzed by the feeling of being watched. Everywhere she goes, she feels his gaze, and it is a gaze full of longing, need, and possession. She didn't know this man was the very soldier she had sent letters to encourage, the very man whose soul she had accidentally bound to hers with her unsuspecting kindness. And it got worse when she discovered the truth, that her act of kindness had created a monster who was now haunting her. Her deepest wish is to know what went wrong. What wrong did she do? For now she feels trapped and isolated, unable to report him to the police because she's paralyzed by fear and a dangerous curiosity, a twisted desire to understand this broken man, perhaps even to heal him. She should have listened to her instincts, but she couldn't help herself. The scene is set in this sprawling, bustling metropolis, a city of contrasts where extreme poverty lives next to unimaginable wealth, where kindness can lead to catastrophe, and where a generous woman and a shattered, obsessed man are about to collide, with consequences that will shake both their worlds and leave the viewer questioning the very nature of love, obsession, and the price of a simple act of kindness. What happens next? How does Vivian Anderson, trapped in a nightmare of her own making, escape the shadow of the soldier she once prayed for? How long can Frederick Gambo remain in the shadows, fueled by an obsession that is rapidly reaching its breaking point? Tune in, because their journey and the shocking truth of their connection is just beginning, and you will not want to miss the emotional chaos that is about to unfold. The psychological trap around Vivian Anderson began to tighten with the calculated precision of a military ambush, converting her once peaceful sanctuary into a prison of absolute terror. Every morning, the heavy Lagos humidity felt like a physical weight pressing down on her chest as she walked the short distance from her apartment to the Yaba bus stop. But it wasn't the heat that made her skin crawl. It was the unmistakable, suffocating sensation of a gaze boring into the back of her neck. She would spin around sharply, her heart hammering against her ribs, searching the sea of hurried faces, street vendors, and yellow minibuses. But there was never anyone holding her gaze, just a fleeting glimpse of a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette slipping behind a concrete pillar or disappearing into the tinted depths of a parked black SUV. The psychological warfare was draining her life force. She stopped making eye contact with strangers. She stopped wearing bright colors, and she found herself double-checking the locks on the bookstore cafe doors 3, 4, 5 times a day. Her aunt, a blunt and practical woman, noticed the rapid deterioration, pointing out the dark circles under Vivian's eyes, and the way her hands trembled whenever a male customer approached the counter too quickly. Yet, Vivian remained silent about the true depth of her nightmare, paralyzed by a deeply rooted, irrational guilt. She had finally connected the dots after a third letter arrived, a letter that explicitly detailed a specific phrase she had written in her original care package note. The realization had hit her like a physical blow. Her stalker was the wounded soldier she had tried to comfort. Her pure, unadulterated act of empathy had been twisted into a beacon for a broken man's obsession. She felt a profound sense of injustice. She had poured goodness into the world from a place of genuine love for those fighting on the front lines, and in return, her freedom was being systematically stripped away. She wanted to tell her family, she wanted to go to the police, but a toxic mix of fear and an intense, dangerous curiosity held her back. She wanted to understand the mind of the man she had inadvertently fractured, foolishly believing that perhaps the same compassion that triggered this nightmare could somehow de-escalate it. Meanwhile, Frederick Gambo was descending deeper into the manic intoxication of his self-appointed role as her invisible guardian. From the air-conditioned, dark interior of his vehicle, he watched her every move, interpreting her obvious terror not as a consequence of his actions, but as a justification for them. In his warped reality, the world was a predatory place, and Vivian was too fragile, too inherently good to survive it without him. He saw the way arrogant wealthy men treated her at the cafe, demanding service with snapping fingers, and his blood would boil with a lethal, protective rage. He began tracking not just Vivian but anyone who crossed her path. This was when the true antagonist of the story emerged to exploit the widening cracks in Vivian's life. Chief Kunle Alao, a notoriously ruthless real estate mogul and a frequent, high-handed customer at the bookstore cafe, had been eyeing the property for months. Alao didn't care about books or coffee. He wanted to demolish the entire block to build a lucrative, high-rise commercial shopping complex. He was a man used to getting what he wanted through intimidation, bribery, and sheer unadulterated malice. Alao began escalating his pressure on Vivian's aunt, sending thuggish associates to loiter outside the shop, disrupting business, and deliberately scaring away the regular clientele. One afternoon, Alao entered the cafe himself, his expensive designer shoes clicking aggressively against the tiled floor, surrounded by a pair of massive, stone-faced security guards. He confronted Vivian at the counter, dropping a thick legal envelope onto the wood, with a smirk that carried the absolute certainty of a predator. He spoke to her with dripping condescension, insulting her family's modesty, mocking their small-scale business, and openly threatening to use his political and financial connections to evict them within the month. Leaving them penniless on the streets of Lagos, Vivian stood her ground, her voice shaking but resolute as she defended her aunt's life's work, refusing to be intimidated by his displays of massive social inequality. She looked Alao directly in the eyes and told him that wealth didn't buy the right to destroy people's lives. Alao's smirk vanished, replaced by an ugly, venomous flash of anger. He leaned over the counter, his breath hot against her face, whispering a vile, explicit promise that he would make her beg for mercy before he was finished with her. He slammed his hand on the counter, shattering a ceramic display tray, and stormed out, leaving Vivian weeping silently from the sheer overwhelming injustice of the encounter. She felt entirely defenseless, a casualty of a system where the rich could crush the poor without a second thought. But what neither Vivian nor Chief Alao realized was that every single second of this interaction had been witnessed. Across the street, parked in the deep shadows of an alleyway, Frederick sat in his vehicle, his gloved hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly the leather groaned under the pressure. Through his binoculars, he had seen the tears streaming down Vivian's face, and he had seen the aggressive, threatening posture of Chief Alao. In that moment, something snapped irrevocably within the former military commander. The calculated discipline of the officer was completely swallowed by the raw, consuming fury of an obsessed protector. Alao had not just threatened a local business. He had threatened the only source of light left in Frederick's scarred, darkened existence. As Alao's luxury sedan pulled away from the curb, Frederick started his engine, pulling out into the chaotic Lagos traffic to follow the billionaire, his mind locked onto a singular, dark directive. Chief Alao would learn the true cost of making Vivian Anderson cry. The psychological warfare surrounding the bookstore cafe intensified to an agonizing fever pitch as Chief Kunle Alao celebrated what he believed to be an easy, inevitable victory. Sitting in his opulent penthouse suite high above Victoria Island, Alao poured himself an expensive glass of whiskey, laughing callously with his associates about the helpless, tearful girl from the cafe. To a man with billions in his bank account, Vivian and her aunt were nothing more than insects to be crushed under the heel of progress. Alao decided it was time to deliver the final, devastating blow to break their spirit completely. The very next evening, under the cover of a sudden torrential Lagos downpour, a group of hired thugs arrived at the bookstore cafe. They smashed the front display windows, spray-painted vile insults across the walls, and threw invaluable, rare books into the muddy puddles outside, destroying decades of her aunt's hard work in a matter of minutes. When Vivian arrived the next morning and saw the catastrophic ruin, she fell to her knees in the wet, shattered glass, weeping uncontrollably at the sheer cruelty and absolute injustice of it all. It seemed as though the villain had won completely, and the system was entirely on his side, as the local authorities casually dismissed her reports, clearly paid off by Alao's massive fortune. But in the deepest shadows across the street, Frederick Gambo was watching. His jaw was set in a rigid, lethal line, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying rage beneath the rim of his black cap. The time for passive observation was over. Alao's arrogance had blinded him to the fact that he was no longer dealing with a helpless girl, but had unwittingly triggered a confrontation with a highly trained, elite military operative who had absolutely nothing left to lose. while Alao spent the following days finalizing the fraudulent eviction notices and gloating to his corporate partners. A silent, invisible trap was being laid beneath his feet. Frederick utilized his immense hidden family wealth and elite military intelligence connections to execute a meticulously planned operation of psychological and financial ruin. Operating completely out of sight, Frederick didn't just want to stop Alao. He wanted to dismantle him entirely. He began a covert campaign of high-stakes corporate sabotage, hacking into Alao's private servers, intercepting encrypted financial transactions, and uncovering a massive, deeply buried web of illegal money laundering, offshore tax evasion, and political bribery that Alao had used to build his empire. Every piece of damning evidence was quietly compiled and duplicated. But Frederick didn't stop at corporate destruction. He brought the psychological warfare directly to Alao's doorstep. No, Alao began experiencing an unsettling, terrifying haunting of his own. It started with anonymous, wax-sealed envelopes left on his private desk, containing nothing but photographs of Alao at his most private moments, taken from angles that should have been impossible to access. Then, the security systems in his highly guarded mansion began to glitch inexplicably late at night, turning off for exactly 3 minutes at a time, leaving him entirely exposed in the dark. Alao's initial arrogance rapidly dissolved into a state of paranoid, sweating panic. He doubled his personal security detail, hired armed bodyguards, and stopped sleeping, constantly looking over his shoulder, feeling the exact same suffocating, invisible terror that he had inflicted upon Vivian. The villain's true, cowardly face was fully exposed behind closed doors, stripped of his financial invincibility. Alao was nothing more than a frightened bully trembling in the dark. The tension building in the narrative reached an absolute boiling point as the date of the forced eviction arrived. Vivian stood outside the boarded-up cafe in the blistering afternoon heat, holding her weeping aunt's hand as a crew of bulldozers and Alao's heavily armed private security guards lined up along the street, ready to reduce the building to rubble. Alao himself arrived in a flashing convoy of luxury vehicles, stepping out onto the asphalt with a triumphant, malicious sneer, eager to personally witness the humiliation and destruction of his victims. He openly mocked Vivian, telling her that her tears couldn't stop the power of real money, and ordered the bulldozer drivers to start their engines. The heavy machinery roared to life, the black exhaust filling the air as the massive metal blades began to move toward the historic structure. Viewers are left holding their breath in absolute suspense, watching the tragic injustice unfold, desperately waiting for the ultimate exposure, as a long, ominous black SUV suddenly cuts through the crowd, parking directly in front of the bulldozers, blocking their path, signaling that the hidden forces of karma are finally ready to step out of the shadows and into the blinding light. The roaring engines of the bulldozers sputtered into an uneasy vibrating idle as the heavy doors of the black's SUV swung open, revealing the absolute climax of this emotional saga. Chief Kunle Alao's sneer faltered for a fraction of a second, his bodyguards instantly stepping forward, hands resting heavily on their holstered weapons. From the vehicle stepped Frederick Gambo, completely discarding his shadows for the first time. He wore a crisp, tailored black suit that accentuated his powerful, imposing military frame, but he wore no mask, no hoodie, and no cap. The harsh, blinding Lagos afternoon sun illuminated the left side of his face and neck, exposing the raw, twisted reality of his deep burned scars in their entirety. The crowd gasped softly, a wave of shock rippling through the bystanders. Alao looked at Frederick's face and let out a loud, mocking laugh to hide his sudden nervousness, loudly shouting for this ruined, deformed beast to get out of the way of progress. But Frederick didn't flinch. He walked forward with the slow, terrifying confidence of a commander walking onto a conquered battlefield. He stopped just inches away from the billionaire, looking down at him with an expression of pure, unyielding dominance. With a silent, dramatic gesture, Frederick signaled his younger brother Emeka, who stepped out of the SUV carrying a sleek briefcase. Accompanied by a team of high-ranking federal anti-corruption officers and heavily armed military police who bypassed Alao's bodyguards entirely, disarming them with brutal, fluid precision, the unmasking of the true power dynamic began instantly, plunging Alao into a state of absolute, unmitigated panic. Frederick opened the briefcase, pulling out a stack of globally verified financial documents, international freezing orders, and arrest warrants signed by the highest judicial authorities in the country. He dropped them one by one onto the hood of Alao's luxury sedan, his deep, resonant voice echoing across the entire street through the sudden silence. Frederick revealed to the public, the press, and the authorities that he had completely weaponized his immense, hidden family wealth to buy out every single one of Alau's bank loans, effectively becoming his sole creditor. More devastatingly, the federal officers announced that the encrypted files Frederick had uncovered had been successfully processed, completely exposing Alau's multi-billion naira international money laundering network, his fraudulent property acquisitions, and his illegal corporate bribery schemes. In a matter of seconds, Alau's entire life's work, his pride, and his massive empire vanished into thin air. His bank accounts were frozen globally, his corporate licenses were permanently revoked, and his assets were officially seized by the state. The viewer witnesses a complete, satisfying triumph of justice as the arrogant billionaire is stripped entirely of his invincibility. Right in front of the very bookstore cafe he had sought to destroy, the scene of Alau's complete humiliation and psychological breakdown unfolded with agonizing detail. The ruthless real estate mogul fell to his knees on the hot asphalt, his expensive designer suit soaking up the dirt of the street he thought he owned. His face turned pale, sweat pouring profusely down his neck as his breathing turned into frantic, desperate gasps. He began to stammer, weeping openly, entirely unconcerned with his pride as he looked up at Frederick and Vivian, begging for mercy, offering to rebuild the cafe 10 times larger, pleading for a second chance. But it was far too late for apologies. The time for mercy had expired the moment he chose to terrorize innocent citizens. As the iron handcuffs snapped violently around Alau's wrists, the federal officers dragged him away toward a waiting police van, his screams of terror fading into the distance. Vivian stood completely frozen, tears of overwhelming relief streaming down her face as she looked at the heavily scarred, beautiful soul standing before her. Frederick turned toward her slowly, completely exposed beneath the bright light, no longer afraid of what she would see. She didn't look at his scars with pity or disgust. She ran straight into his arms, holding him with a fierce, unconditional love that shattered the last remnants of his internal darkness, proving to the entire world that true loyalty and kindness would always triumph over the temporary illusions of corrupt power. The echoes of Chief Kunle Alau's frantic pleas slowly faded into the vibrant, unrelenting atmosphere of Lagos, leaving behind a profound, sacred silence in front of the bookstore cafe. The universe had delivered its ultimate verdict, and the wheels of absolute karma had crushed the oppressor entirely. In the weeks that followed that fateful afternoon, the transformation of Vivian Anderson's life was nothing short of miraculous. Using a fraction of his vast hidden family resources, Frederick Gambo completely funded the total restoration and expansion of the cafe. It was no longer just a modest bookstore tucked between weathered buildings. It became a magnificent, modern literary sanctuary on Lagos Island, featuring beautiful floor-to-ceiling glass windows, warm oak bookshelves, and a vibrant, sunlit space where young Nigerians could create, learn, and find peace. Vivian's aunt wept tears of pure joy as she walked through the doors of the new establishment, realizing that her life's work had not only been saved, but elevated beyond her wildest dreams. Vivian herself no longer walked through the streets of Lagos with her shoulders hunched or her eyes darting in terror. The paralyzing fear that had once confined her to her apartment was completely gone, replaced by a radiant, unshakable confidence. She was safe, she was free, and she was deeply, fiercely loved by the man she had once sought to heal with a single handwritten note. For Chief Kunle Alau, the consequences of his malicious arrogance were swift, absolute, and utterly devastating. The criminal justice system, backed by unassailable military intelligence and forensic financial evidence provided by Frederick, offered no loopholes for bribery. Within months, Alau was convicted on all counts of fraud, money laundering, and corporate sabotage. Every single piece of his ill-gotten empire was dismantled. His high-rise properties were liquidated, his luxury vehicles were seized by the state, and his name became a synonymous warning across Nigeria for the destructive cost of greed. Stripped of his billionaire status, his high society friends, and his expensive designer suits, the disgraced mogul was sentenced to a lengthy term in a maximum security prison, forced to live out his days in a cold, cramped concrete cell. Entirely forgotten by the world he once tried to rule with an iron fist. He had sowed seeds of cruelty and inequality, and he had reaped a harvest of absolute poverty and exile. The social divide that he had used as a weapon against the vulnerable had ultimately swallowed him whole. The true healing, however, belonged to Frederick Gambo. He no longer existed as a ghost lurking in the midnight shadows of Banana Island, nor did he hide his face beneath heavy hoods and dark sunglasses. By standing fully exposed in the blinding light of justice to protect the woman he loved, he had finally conquered the internal trauma that the plane crash had left behind. He learned to accept his physical scars not as a mark of shame or deformity, but as a proud testament to the fierce battles he had fought and survived. Together, Frederick and Vivian turned the cafe into a hub for supporting wounded veterans, creating a beautiful circle of charity that honored the very origin of their profound connection. One evening, as the golden Lagos sunset painted the sky in shades of deep amber and violet, Frederick sat openly on the cafe's outdoor terrace, his hand tightly intertwined with Vivian's as they watched the bustling city move below them. There were no longer any cameras, no secret surveillance, and no hidden letters. There was only the pure, unfiltered reality of two kindred souls who had survived fire and fear to find their ultimate sanctuary in each other. One profound truth this extraordinary story teaches us is to never judge a person by the visible scars they carry, because sometimes those scars were not earned through foolishness or ignorance. They are the honorable marks of a warrior who stood at the forefront of danger and won. True love is not about physical perfection, nor is it about superficial beauty or social status. It is about a willingness to pour your soul into another human being, to stand by them without hesitation, and to love them completely without holding back. Vivian Anderson did not fall in love with a flawless face. She fell in love with the protective, beautiful heart of a soldier who watched over her when she was completely defenseless. Her simple act of kindness, a random letter sent to encourage a stranger, triggered a cascade of destiny that ultimately dismantled a corrupt empire and saved a broken hero. This story proves that no matter how damaged a person might seem, and no matter how dark their past is, genuine love, loyalty, and unshakable kindness possess the absolute power to heal the deepest wounds and bring the dead back to life. My wonderful flowers, I am so deeply grateful that we got to experience this emotional, triumphant journey together, and I am incredibly eager to know your thoughts. What did you think about the poetic karma that found Chief Alao? How did you feel when Frederick finally stepped into the light? Please write your valuable opinions in the comments below. Make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you never miss our upcoming dramatic life stories. Until next time, stay kind, stay safe, and goodbye.